Well, good morning.
Morning.
Morning. Delayed reaction.
You're answering yourself. Good morning. Good morning. Now you know what a teacher feels like.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I sort of do in a way.
Bueller.
So, we will be going to our next topic in the by faith chapter. We'll be in Hebrews 11:7 and in Genesis chapter 5, and we will be discussing this week the faith of Noah. So, Noah, of course, is one of those personalities you probably feel like you don't really have to say much about. He's one of the most well-known men of all time. I think, even amongst people outside the church. I mean, he's like, along with Moses and Adam and Jesus, as being one of the men that everybody already knows about. There's not much really to say about Noah. Everybody kind of knows about him and his story. And certainly the author of Hebrews knew that his readers, being Jews, would know all about Noah. So, what more is there really that we can say about Noah? Well, obviously, in including him in this chapter defining what faith is, it is the faith of Noah that we want to emphasize in bringing him up at this particular point. So why is that important? Well, I think when most people think about Noah, what you tend to think about him in terms of his spiritual life is his obedience to God, in being obedient in the orders to build the ark. I mean, that's what he's known for, is building the ark. And certainly he was obedient to God. I mean, that's his biggest accomplishment that we think of, is him being obedient to God and building that ark and everything. But the author of Hebrews, including him in this particular argument about faith, means that even though he was certainly obedient in building the ark, this obedience, what it was actually a manifestation of what truly mattered, and that was his faith. So that's what we want to focus on in today's lesson, is how his obedience in building that ark was a manifestation of and an outgrowth of what was really important about Noah, and that was his faith in God, in his believing God, and that's what we're going to see. So first of all, just a little background, who was Noah? Well, he's of course introduced initially in chapter 5 of Genesis. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son and named him Noah. He goes on to say, he will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground that the Lord has cursed. So, sort of the background here, obviously his father Lamech, or Lamech, however you pronounce that, he is seeing Noah as enabling him to be a help to him in terms of tilling the ground. Apparently Lamech was a farmer, and he is recognizing the fact that since God had cursed the ground so that it would no longer bring forth its fruit easily, that they would have to work against nature in order to bring the crops forth, that Noah was going to be a help to him. And the reason that's important is because what the word Noah means, what his name means. His name actually means rest. And it comes from a root Hebrew word which means quiet, the idea of peace and quiet, rest. So they named Noah Rest because they saw him as being able to bring comfort to them, I guess, in helping them in tilling the ground. So while Noah would no doubt bring great comfort to his father in his labors and toils, his life would be anything but quiet and restful. Noah would live what we might call a very, adventurous life, actually. And so after Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It's interesting here, I think, other than Adam, Noah is the only other patriarch in chapter 5 to have any of his children named other than the eldest. You know, the whole chapter 5 was, you know, he would list one of the patriarchs and then list who his oldest son was, showing the main line between Adam and Noah. But nobody else other than Adam had the other children named up until Noah. His 3 sons were named. And of course, I think this is the reason for this, I think, is simply because they would, of course, go on to have a big part in what happens later on. So his children are actually named. So I think it's interesting what the meaning of their names are. Shem, I think this one's kind of funny in a way. His name is actually the Hebrew word for name. It's kind of like naming your dog dog or naming your cat cat. You know, his name actually means name. I don't know, but that's not very creative, but that's what it means. But the thing that's interesting is this is where we get the word Semitic or Semite. You know, when you hear the word like anti-Semitic, that's where it comes from, is Shem. It comes from his name, which means name. Ham means hot. I have no reason why he thought his name should be hot, but he did. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he was a handsome
Maybe he was
dude.
good looking. I'm just kidding.
Maybe it was 100 degrees.
Yeah, maybe he was born
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe he was
Who is
very-
hot today?
Yeah, very red faced. I don't know.
And of course, Japheth, his name means expansion, from a root meaning to open up. And so, I don't know, maybe he was, they thought of him,
Expansion.
the idea being the expansion of the population.
Yeah, we've expanded our family.
We expanded our family, but that's what the
So
name.
name, hot, and expansion.
They were very creative, you know.
Pretty awesome nephew.
So what was going on? So what's the background? Of course, I don't want to spend too much time on all of this because obviously the entire story of the lead up to the flood and then the aftermath of the flood, this is 3 chapters worth. We could spend months here just talking about that. And that's not really the subject of what the author of Hebrews is talking about in Hebrews chapter 11. But we have to address some of it in order for it to make sense in terms of what Noah was believing in his faith. So we have to look at some of the run-up to it. And so I think what is significant, the part of the story that is relevant, is to show the great contrast between the character of Noah and the character of literally everybody else on earth at this time. Because that great contrast, I think, is what is relevant. So in Genesis chapter 6, we see some evidence of what is going on. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. That's in verse 5 of chapter 6. Now, like I said, I could go on some of the other verses in this chapter that give some more details, but I think this summarizes it best. Now, from the moment of the fall in Eden, all the way through the present day, I think it's obvious mankind has been by nature a sinful man and has been capable of great evil and wickedness and sin. You know, that's nothing new at this time, and nothing has really changed since that time. However, when you look at the way that this particular verse is structured, it's clear that there was something uniquely awful at this particular time that made it different from what had gone on before and what has happened since. Evil and sin have always been there, but there was something that was particularly extreme at this time in history. To the point of where mankind was irredeemably bad and awful. In a different way than even it is now, although that's kind of hard to believe. But I mean, that should give you some perspective when you think about how bad things even are now. imagine it being irredeemably even worse than it is now. And that should give you some perspective. So I just want to look at some of the Hebrew words that are used in that verse that gives us some idea of the perspective here. The word that is translated wickedness, it's the Hebrew word rah, and it means bad, but it goes more than that. The word means good for nothing, and the root has its idea with something, an object that is spoiled or useless by being broken into pieces. Now, the word certainly is used to imply moral evil, but I think it also includes this idea of the fallen nature of man and the inability of mankind to do anything good because of being broken. Again, it goes back to the root word there, the idea of something being broken into pieces. You know, you think of an object that you can't use anymore because it's broken beyond repair, and all you can do is throw it away. You can't fix it. You know, we've all experienced things that have just gone beyond the point. You know, you think about a car being totaled, you know, to the point where you just can't fix it, and all you can do is send it to the junkyard. You know, that's kind of the idea that's behind this Hebrew word, that it is just irredeemable, unfixable. And so take this into the context of moral evil, and that's where you get the idea of the irredeemable nature, of how bad things have gotten to the point where you just can't fix it anymore, where you just can't, people are so corrupt they're beyond the point of being able to listen to reason, to be able to repent. They've just gone beyond that. And this badness was abundant in quantity. When it said, talking about how great man's wickedness, that word great there, speaks about the abundance in quantity, how much of it was. That is great, not so much in how bad, but how much badness there was. That's what I'm getting to. Not great in size, but great in quantity. The idea that it's not just like bad in one area, or bad in one sense, or maybe one group of people who are bad. It's like everywhere you look, it's corruption and badness. So, not just in one area, but pretty much in everything. I don't often, in fact, hardly ever mention the paraphrase known as the Living Bible, because it's pretty much, I think, useless in understanding in translation or in commentary. But I always remember because I got a copy of the Living Bible when I was a kid, and I remember my mom reading parts of it to me because she thought I'd be able to understand it better. And she read through this particular part of the Living Bible, and I always remember this because I remember hearing my mom reading this, and the way it was in the Living Bible was everything was rotten to the core. And my mom thought that was funny, and she laughed at that, and it's always stuck out in my mind that that's how the Living Bible paraphrased this, that the world was just rotten to the core.
Mom used that a lot too.
Huh?
I think Mom said that a lot too.
Maybe that's why, because that generation,
Yeah.
you know, that was just a phrase that meant something to them. So, we talk about how great man's wickedness on the earth had become. And then this phrase, every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. And so the inclination of the thoughts, those are those two words, Yetzer, and that other one, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. The one that starts with M. I'm not even going to go.
Makashaba.
Okay, thank you. Because I know if I try, I'll make a fool of myself. Beyond what I already am.
I'm going with Makashaba.
So the first one, Yetzer, it means a form. The root word means to squeeze together, like the idea of molding clay to form an object. And then the other one is literally means a contrivance, but the idea is some kind of a work that you do. And the root word means to weave, like weaving a basket or something like that, or weaving, a plaiting your hair, that kind of thing, yeah. But in both cases, these two words describe essentially the way your mind thinks and what it creates. You know, the fact that your mind is thinking about forming something and creating something. And it's the idea of the end result or the end product of what you're thinking about. So why is this significant? Because it's not just that people had evil thoughts, though they did. It's the idea that their evil thoughts were like gears turning to try to accomplish evil deeds. It all has the idea with the outward results of what they were thinking about. It's bad enough to be thinking evil thoughts, but they were always thinking evil thoughts with the end result of creating some evil deed as the outgrowth of what they were thinking. And so these thoughts were evil or bad all the time. That word there that is translated all the time, it's the Hebrew word for day. You've heard the phrase Yom Kippur. That's the holiday Day of Atonement. Yom means day. Well, this is a form of that same word, but in this form of it, it's that idea of daily. It's like every day, day after day. So it's continuous all the time. So essentially the idea here is they never stop thinking these evil thoughts. They wake up thinking it, they go to bed thinking it. And again, it's not just the fact that they're bad thoughts, it's that they're cunning and conniving and plotting to carry them out in deeds. So again, the picture this gives us is that mankind is just corrupt from the inside out, to the point where there's just nothing you can do about it anymore. And I think it's interesting how it shows God reacts to this. It says in verse 6, the Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. That word grieved is the Hebrew word nakam. It means to, that's what it means, literally, to sigh. So it's like God looks at us and goes, you ever felt like that about somebody?
Yes.
All year last year.
So that's what he's saying literally is God is in heaven looking at creation and just,
I roll in face palm.
what are you going to do? What are you going to do?
Wipe them out.
And so, none of this, of course, God is omniscient. None of this, of course, was a surprise to God. God, of course, knew in his omniscience that this is what would happen. But this doesn't mean that it lessens the grief he feels. Even knowing that this was going to happen already, not being surprised by it, but yet God still loves the people he created, and he can't help but have pain, emotional grief over seeing it happen. Even though he knew it was going to happen, he still grieved. Even when you know somebody is going to do something wrong and you know it ahead of time, it still hurts when you see it unfold. And so God is grieved that this happened and it comes to this point. He didn't want it to happen. He gave us freedom of choice, so he knew it was going to happen. But it still pains him greatly to see it happen. So his reaction, of course, verse 7, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth. And that word wipe, it means to rub out or erase. So to me it's really remarkable and striking to think how bad things have gotten so quickly. For God to see mankind as so utterly beyond redemption that his only choice is to blot them out of existence and start over. That's just, you think about, we're only probably 1,000 years, I didn't add it up and do the math this time, but we're probably only 1,000 years from Adam, and we're at the point where it's gone too far to let it go any farther. And, from our perspective, of course, we always want to react with saying, oh God, how could God do that and just destroy everybody? That's such an awful thing for God to do. But we got to understand that what we're seeing here, and it's impossible for us to perceive it because as bad as things are, it's so much worse at this time, that essentially they would destroy themselves if God didn't put a stop to it. I mean, that's essentially how bad it is. Just think about it from the perspective of they would destroy themselves if he didn't put a stop to it. And so, therefore, it had gone beyond what God could condone anymore. You know, there comes a time when no matter how much you love somebody, you have to put a stop to it. And it got to that point. He had to put a stop to it. If there were any other way, if there was any other option, I think we can trust God's justice enough to know that he would do it. Because he's through history, we know how long-suffering he is. Had there been another option, God would have done it. So I think we can trust that there was really no other option. Just think about the extent that the evil it could have gotten. It would have literally been hell on earth if he hadn't put a stop to it. But in verse 8, this is where Noah comes in. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. That word in the Hebrew is the Hebrew version of the word grace. It's the word that when they translated it into Greek, it is the Greek word charis, that is the English word grace. So he's essentially saying that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so, just like in the case of Enoch, like we talked about 2 weeks ago, we can't conclude from this that Noah was sinless. That would be impossible. But that's why I pointed out, while we spent some time talking about the state of the rest of humanity, is that in stark contrast to the rest of humanity, Noah was not beyond redemption. Noah was the one man to whom God felt there was redemption possible. This was a man that God could give a second chance to, he could extend grace and mercy to, and he offered Noah the opportunity to be saved from what was coming. And another perspective to think of, if Noah was the one man who had found grace in the eyes of God, it would have been cruel to Noah to allow the rest of that evil to go on, because it would have eventually destroyed Noah and made Noah's life hell. So it was an extension of God's love to Noah to wipe out the rest of humanity, essentially, because it would have been unfair to Noah. That's how bad it had gotten, that there was only one man left whom he could deal with. So what about Noah? In Genesis 6:9, we're told a little bit about Noah's character. Noah was a righteous man. Now again, when we say that, we don't mean sinless. The Hebrew word there means to be in the right, to be just or lawful. The idea is that he was not a lawbreaker. Now, of course, this was before the giving of the official Mosaic law as such, but even at this time, there were certain expectations of what a good person would do and what a good person would not do. Even before the written law, we all have a conscience telling us right from wrong. Noah did not break these moral and ethical laws. He was a just, lawful man. And it says he was blameless among all the people of his time. The word there was translated in the King James Version as perfect. And that's because it, just like the Greek version of that word, it means someone who is whole, complete. And in this case, in this context, undefiled, truthful. It's speaking of somebody that has integrity. When we think about that word blameless, it means you can't blame them for anything. You look at them and there's no crime, or there's no moral depravity, or there's no lack of integrity that you could blame on Noah. But here's, I think, the real kicker. He walked with God. I think this is significant because there's only one other man that is described that way. And who was that?
Enoch.
Enoch. It's the same way that he described Enoch. Enoch walked with God, meaning he was a God follower. He was on the move in his spiritual life, going where God wanted him to go, faithful to the plan that God had for his life. Just like Enoch, Noah walked with God. I also think this kind of ironic. Enoch walked with God, and so he left the rest of humanity but took Enoch. Noah walked with God. He took the rest of humanity and left Noah. It's kind of, he did the inverse thing.
I think it was because that he wanted to give humanity another chance, and if
Yes.
he,
Well, they hadn't gotten so bad at that time.
yeah. So keeping Noah on Earth would allow a remaking of humanity.
Right, right. I just think it's ironic that the two people described the same way he
An
dealt
opposite,
with in inverse ways. I don't know. That's, again, that's the theology nerd in me. I see things like that and they stand out to me. But I just think it's interesting that he went the opposite way with each one. But at any rate, he walked with God. So I think this tells us, in contrast to the rest of humanity who were walking completely away from God, they were going in the opposite direction of God. And then this one man walking with God. So, back in Hebrews chapter 11, in the first part of verse 7, and then, of course, referring back to Genesis 6, what was it that Noah did? Why is he being singled out by the author of Hebrews? By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. So, again, I go back to what I said in the introduction. Building the ark would seem like an act of obedience to God's orders. So how does Noah's faith come into this? Well, let's just think about what Noah had to believe. Let's think about it from Noah's perspective when God comes to him. And again, I'm jumping back and forth, I know, sorry, but back in Genesis 6. God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. And that's Genesis 6:13. Now imagine for a moment being Noah. You're Noah, and yeah, you've seen how bad things have gotten, but you know you're only, centuries from when God created Adam and said to replenish the earth. We're just getting started here, literally, still, from a historical perspective. We're just getting started here. And yet here God comes to Noah and says, I'm going to wipe out the whole earth. That is a completely radical thing for Noah to hear. From a human perspective, it had to be kind of absurd. I mean, not even really make sense. Really, God? God had never acted in this way before. This was a completely unique event. So, first of all, Noah had to believe that God was going to do something he had never done before, which would seem to go against human perspective of what would make sense for God's plan, since you just got things started and now you're going to destroy it. So he first of all had to believe God that he would in fact follow through on destroying the world. Second of all, in verse 14 he says, so make yourself an ark. That sounds simple. Go make an ark,
So remember how I said earlier my friend Caleb went on a road trip with his parents? Okay, well his dad is a pastor. And they went up to Kentucky and they went and saw the Creation Museum and the Ark, and he's like, it was unbelievable how just...
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
And I'm not giving you the whole thing here because that's not the purpose of this story, but God goes on to describe in detail how to construct it, what to make it of, how big to make it is. This ain't no cruise ship.
He said it's massive.
It's massive,
Yeah.
This was going to be a massive vessel. So, in order to do this, that is an enormous effort of time and resources and all that would have to be done. It would take years to do. And he had to believe God to do this. I mean, yes, it was an act of obedience because he obeyed him in doing it, but he had to trust that what God was telling him was true. Number one, that destruction was coming. Number two, that you could build this ark. And number three, that it would save you. We had to believe it,
With the other people ridiculing him.
with the other people ridiculing. And so, thirdly, he says in verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark. So while the rest of the world is going to suffer God's judgment, Noah and his family are going to be safe. And they're going to be heirs of this special promise. Am I saying it right? The Noahic covenant?
Noahic.
They're going to be saved from judgment and instead receive God's grace. So in order to lift that hammer and drive that first nail or peg or whatever he used, he had to believe God that he was going to destroy the world. He had to believe God that he would have time to build this ark. He had to believe God that the ark would save them. He had to believe God that he would preserve them through what was to come. And he had to believe God that he would fulfill this promise, the covenant that he would make with them. So yes, it was an act of obedience, but before he did that, he had to say, I believe you, God. I'm going to trust what you're telling me is true. Because he could have said, this is ridiculous. Ain't no way I'm doing that. I don't think so.
I mean, that was a huge undertaking.
Maybe I'll
Building
just
that by
maybe
hand.
I'll just move to higher ground. Maybe that'll work.
I mean, because that's a huge undertaking. He had power tools and everything else. Like, I mean, he was.
Yeah, he couldn't exactly go to Home Depot and buy some Craftsman tools.
Right, like, or
Well,
even
buy Craftsman tools at Home Depot.
getting the lumber and stuff. I mean, it's not like you can go and buy it pre-made. He was.
And he was hundreds of miles inland, by the way. It's not like he was living on the coast. So yeah, this required a great deal of believing what God told him. So when we focus on him being obedient, yes, he was. But that obedience was an outgrowth of his faith, because he could have just said, I don't believe that's going to happen. Or, yeah, God, yeah, I'll do it, but I'm not doing it this week.
Well, up until that time.
I'm busy this week. I'll work on it next week.
Up
I'm
until
sorry.
that time, wasn't it that it had never rained? Wasn't it that the earth was like, had mist from the ground, almost like a greenhouse effect?
Well, this earlier, we didn't go into this, but it did earlier when it described how there was, yes, that the things were watered by kind of a gentle mist all the time. And while it's not explicitly said, there is the theory that there was this canopy of water vapor around the world at that time, which moderated the temperatures, and that water vapor canopy was part of the water that was precipitated, that was the source of a lot of the flood water, was this water vapor canopy, which had kind of made a greenhouse effect around the world and made it tropical everywhere, even at the poles. And that was part of what precipitated and was, in addition to underwater sources that erupted, those two things together were the source of the waters of the flood.
Which is why the people ridiculed him.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you could say it never rained, but they'd never seen anything like this, certainly.
Oh, by flood. Yeah, that would.
It may have
destroy
been
the earth.
misty or drizzly,
Right.
is what I'm saying. There may have been
Yeah.
drizzle. Maybe even
But
been
the
times
rain
of
for
light
4
rain, what
days.
we would call just a little rain. But nothing like a thunderstorm, no.
Yeah.
You're right.
And so that took a great leap of faith on its own, just that one piece of it.
Exactly. The point is, what was happening were things that had never happened before, and had never been seen before. If God tells you something is going to happen that we've seen happen before, if God came up and told me a volcano is going to erupt, well, we've seen volcanoes erupt, so yeah, okay, I can believe that. But if God comes up and tells you something that's never happened before, you've never seen any evidence of ever happening before, it's a unique event in history, then It's a matter of whether you believe God or not. And he had a choice. That's the thing. Noah had a choice. He could have said, that doesn't make sense. I don't think so. But he didn't. He believed God that it was going to happen. So, verse 22. Noah did everything just as God had commanded him. Yes, Noah was obedient to God. But in order to obey God, he had to believe what God had told him. So Noah, it says, was 600 years old when the floodwaters came on the earth. And Noah and his sons, and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. So first he believed God in building the ark. But secondly, he believed God in entering the ark. It took a great deal of faith to actually trust your life to a big floating box, which is what the word ark means. In case you're wondering, it means box. So to go into a great big
With
box
a bunch of animals.
with just animals, with the flood coming, and you go in this box, because think about it, again, from the human perspective, even when the flood waters started coming, what would have been the first reaction? Head to high ground.
Right.
That's what would have made sense.
Yeah.
You know, get your life jacket. Or start, building barriers, But that's not what he did. He goes in this great big box. And the with animals thing, and this, after living for a week inside a camper with 3 cats.
3 cats. He had all
Can you
the
imagine?
animals of creation. The smells, the sounds, the amount of food that it would take to feed them all that time.
The litter boxes.
And I'm sure that it was divinely taken care of, but think about all these animals that are usually enemies of one another being under the same roof, and they're not killing each other. That had to be divine, that they weren't going after each other and trying
I
to
think a
kill each
lot of
other.
them went into a form of hibernation during most of it. That's what I
That's a
believe.
good point.
Because that would make sense. But you're right, though. But you're right.
Yeah.
But again, I just think about being for a week with my 3 cats in the camper. I can't imagine that.
But when Daniel went in the lion's den, scripture says that God closed the mouths of the lions.
Yeah, he did.
So, yeah, I'm sure that on the ark there was a lot of divine intervention.
Well, I'm sure he didn't have the lions on the same, right next to the lambs.
But still.
I'll put y'all up here. And all that. But then, and again, I'm skipping a lot, but again, the faith, Noah's faith is what's important in this lesson. In chapter 8, then God said to Noah, come out of the ark. Now, after going through all of this apocalyptic disaster and being safe and dry in the ark, just coming out of the ark was also a great act of faith. Because even though it took faith to get in the ark, once you're safe and warm and dry and comfortable, then you may not want to leave it. You may not want to. Sometimes we get in a comfort zone that we don't want to leave. And it's, the ark certainly was not what you would call the ideal way to live, but it kept them safe and warm and dry for that period of time. And he didn't know what the rest of the world was going to be like and what he was going to face when that door opened. But God kicked him out of the ark. He said, I wanted you in the ark, but now I want you out of the ark. There becomes a time when you got to get out of the ark. And that also takes faith, because what was he going to face? A destroyed world. That is a great fearful thing, to wonder how you were going to live now. And you didn't know for sure where they were. And so, at some point, you got to get out of the ark and move on. And I think a lot of times we get stuck in our arks. Even if they're not ideal, even if the ark was the ark sometimes is a refuge from something. It's our little comfort space, and we don't want to leave it. And sometimes God has to kind of push us out that door and say, get on out of the ark, because now you got something else to do. Now you got to get busy. Now you got to get busy. Got a lot to do. So he had to believe God in leaving the ark So here we go, whiplash, back to Hebrews chapter 11 again. By faith Noah, when warned about things not seen, and I think that's really kind of, that phrase, things not seen, is what's really I want to focus on. Because it harkens back to the very definition of faith from verse 1 of Hebrews 11. Now faith is being certain of what we do not see. So we can see how Noah's obedience was really an act of faith. God had warned him about these things that were going to happen in the future in a unique way that had never happened before. So it was all, from his perspective, absurd and impossible to believe by human standards. Yet this was the essence of his faith, is believing that which he cannot see. Because you trust the one who's telling you. And he did so, it says, in holy fear. And I really don't like that translation because it gives you this idea of being afraid. But what's important is that Greek word. It's not the Greek word phobia or phobos, where we get dread or terror from. It's a different Greek word, and it simply means to be cautious. The root word means caution, or being aware of your surroundings. Like being at your campsite and being aware that a bear might walk by.
And having your gun ready.
And having your gun. But in this context, it kind of means having a respect of your surroundings, or in this case, respect God.
That's what I was going to say. Like whenever we're supposed to fear God, we're not supposed to be afraid of Him. We're supposed to.
Right. It's the idea of being a respect.
Yeah.
But I just think it has, but the root word has this idea of being aware of your surroundings and being cautious. So I think in this religious sense, it's the idea of he was aware of the consequences of not trusting God. Because God is trustworthy, so even though it maybe to him made no sense, he says, but this is God telling me, so I'm going to trust him. So it talks about really Noah's attitude toward God, what God had told him. He was a man who had walked with God, so he trusted and respected what God told him. So he built an ark to save his family. So his act of faithful obedience was not purely selfish either. His faith also saved his entire family. He had a greater perspective than just his own life. And then lastly, it says, by his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Now, what that means there, that word means to pass judgment or pass sentence against someone. So what he was saying here is, what?
Peter.
Oh. What he's saying here is by believing God and building and then going on this ark, he proved to the rest of the world that they were guilty. His obedience basically showed up what the rest of the world had failed to do. So, to me, this kind of implies that if the rest of the world had heeded God's warning, they could have been saved too. If they had done the same thing, if they had believed what God had warned, maybe they would have had that opportunity as well. But he confirmed the verdict of guilty by obeying. And then he became the heir of righteousness that comes by faith. So basically, this phrase is just another way of describing the theological term justification, which we normally think of as one of Paul's theological words. Justification is that sovereign act of God whereby the believing sinner is declared righteous by God because of their faith. So what he's saying here is God declared Noah righteous not because of his obedience, but because of his faith. And because of this, Noah became the heir of God's covenant, the Noahic covenant from Genesis 12. God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I am making between me and you. And so it's essentially, the author of Hebrews is essentially saying the same thing about Noah that Paul said about Abraham in Romans 4:3. Paraphrasing Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. This is, the author of Hebrews is saying the same thing about Noah. Noah believed God and therefore was justified. Therefore he became the heir or the recipient of that promise, of the covenant that he made with him. So Noah believed God and was declared righteous by God, becoming the heir of his covenant. So we have to conclude then that it was his obedience was merely the manifestation, the result of the inward attitude of faith. He believed God, and that's what saved him, not his obedience.